Thank you so much for joining us today for History in the Kitchen. It is just me today on Zoom. Laura has stepped away to have a learning experience of her own today. We will miss her, but we're excited to be joined by Holly this morning, who is my support tech over there on Zoom. And of course, as always, I'm Lacey, and I am super excited about sharing this recipe with you. I'm going to ask Holly to pop up the recipe on the screen for us so we can take a look at that. And while she does that, I am going to turn my oven on to 350 degrees. All right, next slide, please, Holly. So we're making a recipe today that has a slightly weird name. When I talk about this recipe to my mom, I have to call it the chicken dish, because every time I say the word pudding in association with chicken, it's not a good association for her. So I'm curious about this recipe for everyone. Is there anything that stands out for you? It's this really interesting dish, a baked pudding. And I'm curious if there's anything that, is standing out for you about it, anything that's odd or different or unusual, or something that sounds like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Feel free to drop it in the chat as I take one more look through my recipe, and I'm greasing my baking dish for later as well. I'm going old school, and I'm using some of the leftover lard from our last program to do that, and just wiping it on with a paper towel. So we had anyone shout out in the comments, Holly, about anything that stands out about this recipe for them?
We have not, no.
Okay. Well, I think it's fascinating if we read in the middle there, take 4 young chickens. After cleaning them nicely, cut off the legs, wings, etc., and put them in a saucepan with some salt and water and a bundle of thyme and parsley. We don't boil chicken for recipes like this today. If we're going to, say, make chicken pot pie, if I had to pick a way to cook my chicken, it would probably be roasted, because that puts in so much flavor. And yet here we have one with boiling. So that's something that always strikes me as very interesting when I make this dish. And for those of you who've joined us in the past, I'm looking at our butter in this recipe. You may remember that I have said that if it indicates fresh butter, that is unsalted butter. But in this case, there is actually no indication of whether this is salted or unsalted butter. So in the 18th century, the default was salted, unlike today where the default typically is unsalted butter. So we are using salted butter in my recipes there. Holly, can you pop the spotlight onto the ingredients camera, please? I have not turned that on. There we go. Okay, so you can see I've got my ingredients out here. I've got my salted butter. I've got my eggs. I've got some flour and some milk and some pepper. I'm not adding any additional salt because I am using salted butter. I also started chopping up my parsley and the thyme that I braved Virginia's weather today to go rescue out of our herb garden. So these are very fresh sprigs of thyme today that we've got going on here. I also still need to chop my chicken. So
also, Lacey, we have a comment that says, MC Garrett says, I like the phrase cleaning them nicely. Having grown up on a farm where we butchered our chickens ourselves, cleaning them was always the challenge. Pin feathers were the big challenge.
Oh, I can imagine. I will have to say that I have only a very small number of times dealt with unprocessed meat. So I have not had that experience super often. And I can absolutely imagine that it is something that was really hard, especially if you had to do it every time you wanted to eat chicken. And this is something that, of course, people in the 18th century did every day. All right, so I've got most of my parsley and my thyme right there, all chopped up together, nice and fine, as you can see. I'm going to leave a couple of sprigs of thyme unchopped. I'm going to strip this one just by pinching my fingers along the stem and pulling them down to remove those. And I'm going to chop the rest of this in with my thyme, but I'm going to save this out. If you're looking at the modern recipe, the adaptation, you'll see that you can lay a sprig or two of thyme on top of the batter for a fancy pudding. And I'm going to go for a fancy pudding today since we are making a pudding that was acceptable for the Mason's table. So I'm just going to chop the rest of that thyme up and incorporate it in with the rest. And then I'm going to chop up my chicken. So I love this recipe. This is from, as you can see, you can take down that screen share too, by the way, Holly. As you can see, this was from a cookbook called The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph, which was first published in 1824. It was something that was meant for the gentry level of society. It was something that likely the Masons were eating and was being prepared by enslaved cooks for them. That being said, you could see as MC Garrett commented for us, they talk about cleaning the chickens first. This was also something that if you had leftover chicken or leftover poultry, it could easily be made into a second use for that same meat. And I've done that with programs at Gunston Hall where we've had chicken the day before and I've saved it and made it into chicken pudding like this one the next day. So it's a great leftovers recipe. Now I'm chopping my chicken with a knife, obviously, but if you're doing this program at home with kiddos who don't have fantastic knife skills, a slightly more modern take on chopping the meat is, of course, shredding it. And that's a great one for kiddos to do with their chicken breast and a fork. And I just used chicken breast for this recipe today. I didn't go for any of the dark meat, but just with a fork, shredding the chicken apart. When I was a kid, I loved doing this. This was one of my favorite tasks when we were doing pulled chicken recipes and a variety of other things where we needed shredded or chopped chicken. So this is a great way for kiddos to participate in this recipe. What do you think, Holly, so far? Is this a recipe you'd eat?
Oh, absolutely, especially on a day like today where it's cold and snowy. It's a nice comfort food.
The weather picked the absolutely correct day to snow in relationship to this program. So I'm just getting my chicken all shredded up, and in a minute I'm going to set that aside and start with my batter. Anyone have any thoughts or questions at this point about this recipe or anything else associated with our History in the Kitchen program? I am making a mess, though, while I'm doing this. I'm getting my shredded chicken everywhere.
I personally am curious, Lacey, like who would have been eating this dish?
This is absolutely something we would see on the Mason's table. So this is something that, while very simple, was definitely in the gentry, upper levels of society realm of foodways in the 18th century. It's possible that someone like Thomas Halbert or John Ward, who were tenant farmers on Mason property, were consuming a dish like this as well. But this is absolutely a fancy dish. All right, I'm gonna finish up the rest of my chicken by chopping. That'll go just a smidge quicker, and then we can get on to making the batter today. I should say that we are not going to completely finish this dish while we're together today. It is going to need to go into the oven to be baked for about 30 to 45 minutes. We will not see the finished product that I am making right now come out of the oven, but I do have a dish to show you so you know what it looks like when it comes out of the oven. All right, so I've got my chicken chopped, I've got my parsley and thyme chopped, and I've got some time set aside to do some decoration on the top of the pudding. So I'm gonna set this aside for the moment and move on.
Lacey, Gail has a question. At what temperature do we bake this?
350. So I believe, oh, and there goes my 350. It's up to temp. Mary Randolph does not indicate in her original recipe, but 350 is a good temperature for this. And you'll notice if you read through the adaptation that I am a fan of the least possible dishes. So we are going to crack our eggs directly into our big bowl here. We're gonna beat those up first. So we're using 3 large eggs. I'm just gonna go ahead and crack those straight away in here.
MC Garrett also asks, are the eggs the rising agent in this, or is there something that doesn't, or is it something that doesn't particularly rise?
There is a little rise, and the eggs are absolutely the leavening agent in this recipe. All right, so I've got those all in my bowl, and I need another fork. And I'm just gonna beat those together. They're nice and blended. And next up is my butter, and I need melted butter for this recipe. So I'm gonna pop over to the microwave and melt this up. Now my butter is at room temperature, so it's going to melt pretty quickly. If you're working with cold butter, either from the fridge or from the freezer, it may take a little longer. And you just want it to come up to melted temperature. And I'm not immediately going to add it into my eggs because the warm butter can cook the eggs, and we don't want that to happen at this stage. So I'm not quite there yet. I didn't quite put it in for enough time. So I'm gonna take another 10 or 15 seconds on my butter. So I love this dish because it makes me think a lot of chicken pot pie. And I love using leftover chicken to make chicken pot pie. I'm curious if anyone who is following along with us today has a favorite leftover chicken dish, whether that is a historic dish like this one, which you could use leftover chicken for, or a more modern dish. Feel free to pop it in the chat or shout out loud. And while you're doing that, I'm going to add our 1 cup of milk to my beaten eggs and give that a stir.
So this isn't a chicken dish, but after Thanksgiving, my dad usually makes, instead of chicken and dumplings, turkey and dumplings.
I love it. Yeah,
Yeah,
we do turkey soup after Thanksgiving.
it's definitely a very good comfort food.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So our next addition to our mixture is our flour. I'm not going to add all of this flour. This is about 3/4 of a cup. I'm only going to add about half a cup of it to my bowl because we want this batter to be pretty thin. So last week we were looking for a pretty thick pancake batter for our apple fritters. For our chicken pudding, we want a pretty thin batter. So I have that extra if I need it. If my batter is looking a little thin, I can add more to it.
So Rhonda said that she enjoys making pulled chicken barbecue. And then MC says, I make stir fry out of most of my leftovers, just throw them all together in a large skillet or wok and then taste for seasoning.
That's awesome. So
I personally, oops, sorry, Lacey.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I personally get the frozen stir fry vegetables, and that comes in handy so much. So I'm going to take your advice, MC.
So the reason I ask is that there were so many dishes in the 18th century that did use leftovers, and it's not just people who were tenant farmers or people who were enslaved who consumed leftover foods. People of the Masons level of society did as well. They often had leftovers from dinner, which was their middle of the day meal. They're what we would kind of think of as lunch, but dinner in the 18th century was the much more social meal in the 18th century over supper, which was their evening meal. And you could expect, had you been at the table in the 18th century, to see some of the same dishes from dinner appear on the table again at supper. So I'm working to get all of my lumps out. You can see I've got a very, very lumpy batter right now. And I haven't even added my butter yet. I'm just whisking away to try to get as many of those lumps out as possible. This is also a great dish in the 18th century for this time of year because it doesn't use a whole lot of fresh fruit and veg. It doesn't really use any fresh fruit and veg. Although you may have caught that I did, in fact, harvest the thyme on site here today. Thyme is a perennial herb. It will keep growing through the winter. It's very hardy, so it doesn't look very pretty right now, but it's starting to put out its new spring growth, and you can get fresh thyme off of it right now. Parsley, on the other hand, in the 18th century was probably dried at this time of year. Parsley can overwinter, which means that it can keep its green on it through the winter. Most of the time, though, parsley will die back and come back in the spring. Although, if anyone out there, I know we have at least one of our garden volunteers out there following us on Zoom. If anyone else is a gardener and has any recommendations on how to get yourself fresh parsley over the winter, I'd love to hear them.
I actually had somebody put in the chat a recipe for, I'm gonna not pronounce this correctly, but a chicken divan with broccoli and chicken and bechamel sauce, Parmesan cheese, and it's the whole entire recipe. So I appreciate this a lot.
That sounds amazing. And if you are not super comfortable with Zoom, a quick tip, you can save the chat. And how you do that is if you're in the chat over on the right-hand side, there is a little 3-dot button. If you click on that, there'll be an option to save your chat, and it will download it as soon as you leave the Zoom meeting.
So we had another question. I know for some batter dishes, the temperature of the ingredients is important. Are you making this with all the ingredients at room temperature?
I am today. That was most typical in the 18th century, was all room temp ingredients. It does not particularly matter for this recipe. I have made it with eggs fresh from the fridge. I've made it with gluten-free flour. I've made it with milk fresh from the fridge. So the gluten-free flour obviously doesn't have anything to do with temperature. Yeah, it does. For this recipe, it doesn't particularly matter.
And then Margaret said a row cover can help herbs over winter.
That is a great thought, of course. And they had some really fun ones in the 18th century. They were called cloches, and they were little glass jars that you could put over the top of them. So my butter has cooled. I'm about to add that to my batter. I still have a few lumps in there, but I'm going to use the addition of my herbs and some of my other ingredients to help get those out. So mix that all in. And the fat, the butter in this recipe just helps give it a nice creamy mouthfeel. In the 18th century, of course, they were also using what we would consider today to be whole milk, though of course it was not homogenized. So they had to shake it or strain the cream off the top in order to get milk without a huge amount of milk fat in it.
And there was another question. Will we, yes, I will send this recipe of the chicken pudding. I can either put it in the chat or were you gonna, excuse me, send it to the participants after this?
You should, you should already have received a link to the recipe via your confirmation email and an email that went out just about 10 minutes before the program started. So you'll have a link to a PDF of the file that you can download. Holly has put it in the chat at least once already. Holly, if you wouldn't mind dropping that file in the chat again, that would be great. And then in probably in about a week, based on my schedule, I'll be able to get the Zoom recording up on our YouTube page that will also have a link to the recipe.
Yes, and I just dropped it in the chat again. So if anybody has trouble, please message me.
So I am about to add my pepper, as I said, because I'm using salted butter. I am not choosing to add salt to my recipe today, but that is totally up to you. I like a fair amount of pepper in this recipe, so I'm going to add about 3 pinches, so 3-4 pinches, so quarter to half a teaspoon. And then I am ready to add my other ingredients. Now remember, I'm saving my sprigs of thyme off to the side because I'm going to put those on top of the pudding. And I'm going to go ahead and chuck in my parsley and my thyme to start with. You could chuck everything in all at once, up to your preference. I'm just hoping to use the texture of the thyme and the parsley to get out those last chunks before I add the mass of the chicken.
An MCS stated upcycling version of the cloth is to cut the top off a 2 or 3 liter bottle and put them over smaller plants over the winter.
Yeah, we're actually starting plants for the garden and for our plant sale. Keep your eyes peeled on our website. That should go up soon. That will be April, every Saturday in April and the first Saturday in May starting April 2nd, as well as Sunday, April 24th. And that will include some plants that we've started in milk jug greenhouses in our courtyard here at Gunston Hall. Right now we've got parsley out there and chervil and sorrel, all herbs that were used in the 18th century. I just started yesterday some flowers, and I started blackberry lilies and what was the other one? Oh, Maltese cross, which is a member of the dianthus family. It is related to the carnation and to China pinks. No, I said that wrong. It's the Lychnus family, but it looks very similar. Okay, all right, so I've gotten my parsley and my thyme all mixed into my batter, and you can see it's very liquid. That's good. If you weigh down the liquid with too much flour, the eggs won't be able to cause it to rise as it bakes in the oven. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop my chicken in. And I used, to get my 3 cups of chicken today, I used about 2.5 chicken breasts. I'm gonna give that a stir through. I actually, now that I've added the chicken, I think I want a little bit more liquid. So I have to run and get my milk. So I will be right back. If you have any questions, pop them into the chat and I'll answer them when I get back. All right. So I'm just gonna eyeball it. I added about a cup of milk to start with. I think I just wanna add a couple more tablespoons just to get it to the right consistency. I've made this dish many a time in our hearth kitchen at Gunston Hall, and it is a fan favorite. A friend of mine who was not able to join us today makes this all the time, and she saw that we were making it and sent me a message of indicating her upset that she wasn't able to join us today.
So just for, I'm not the best cook in the world. Why did you add more milk? Would the consistency would have been strange?
So the consistency was too thick. We kind of want the chicken just to be, you can see how it's kind of floating in the milk right now. It looks that way anyway. Before I added the additional milk, it kind of looked like this, where I didn't have as much, I had kind of more chicken than I had batter. So I just needed to change the balance out a little bit and added a couple more tablespoons of milk. So it is ready to go in the oven. So I'm pouring that in the pan that I greased earlier. This is a fun reproduction from Colonial Williamsburg. Fortunately, they don't make them anymore. So I hope I never break it. So I'm just getting this kind of evenly spread, getting that chicken through there, and you can see it's pretty liquid, and we want it to be that way, and we want to bake it not until it is completely solid. We want it to have a little bit of a wobble, because as soon as we take it out of the oven, we take it out of the heat, but the chicken pudding itself will still retain some of that heat. It will actually keep cooking for a couple of minutes after we take it out of the oven. I'm just gonna rinse my hands off and pop this guy into the oven. And I'm gonna set that to bake for about 30 minutes. I'm gonna check on it in about 15 just to see where it is. Because I have done this multiple, oh, I forgot to put the thyme on top. Out of the oven it comes. So you can see I stripped the stems on these guys. So we've got some stems down here, but we've got some of the leaves still on the top. And I'm just gonna lay these across the pie or the pudding in just kind of a pretty arrangement. And they'll bake into the top of the pie, but it'll be easy to take them off If you've ever had the misfortune of getting a thyme stem in your mouth when someone hasn't been cautious about stripping them, it's not pleasant. So in that goes again. And I've got my 15-minute timer, so I'll check on it in about 15 minutes and see how it goes. So I made a very small chicken pudding earlier this morning so that you could see the final texture and what it should look like when it comes out of the oven. And here it is. So I made an itty bitty little third of a recipe, so it's very small, but you can see just around the edges it was starting to brown up. If it browns up in the center, that's perfect too. This one is perfectly cool. I baked it early enough this morning that it's very cool. I do like to eat this warm, but I'll eat it cold too. Chuck a little mustard on it, maybe. It's good. It's a good snack. It's a good lunch.
There's a question in the chat about what do you serve with this?
So the original recipe, Holly, can you check that back up on screen for us?
Sure thing.
So the original recipe, right down there at the very end, you can see it says, send it up with a nice white gravy in a boat. So this is usually when they say a white gravy, it usually means a milk gravy. So butter, flour, and then add in milk and cook it until it thickens, season it to your preference. If you wanted to have this as a main dish, in the 18th century, this was a side dish. This is something they would put with a variety of other dishes on the table. But you could well serve this with a main dish today. And I would personally do it with a side of broccoli and mashed potatoes, or maybe a side salad with a balsamic gravy, balsamic dressing. Any of those options I think would be really good if you want to serve this as a main dish today.
And then we have another question. Margaret is asking what spices were typically used in a white gravy.
That is a great question. In the 18th century, salt and pepper are super common in dishes like that, and in dress gravies like that. Nutmeg would be the other major spice I would expect to find in a white gravy in the 18th century. If you look through many recipes in the 18th century, whether they're sweet or savory, gravies, drinks, all kinds of meat dishes, nutmeg is hands down one of the most used spices in the 18th century. I would expect to see nutmeg in addition to that one. So it looks like I overcooked, or I did not have enough liquid in this first one that I made this morning. As I said, I only made a third of a recipe, so it's wee, but it's very thick, which told me I didn't have enough liquid. I had too much flour. But I'm sure the flavor is going to be amazing, so I'm going to give it a taste and see what's going on here. That's good. So I've got the parsley and the thyme coming through really nicely. I can taste the pepper. The chicken is really well cooked. It's not rubbery. It's very tender still. And it does have that kind of pot pie-like flavor to it, which is what I really like about this dish. So for all it doesn't quite look like what it should, it tastes really good. Any other thoughts or questions from anyone today?
So there is a question. Will you post pictures of the finished one when it comes out of the oven?
Yes, I will append that to the Zoom recording. And I may see if when the timer goes off in about 5 minutes, we can get a peek in the oven. I'll have to rearrange my cameras a little bit, but this one over here is freestanding, so I should be able to pop that down and get a look in the oven in a minute.
Another thought is there seems to be a great deal of similarity between the white gravy and the bechamel sauce.
Yes, yes. A white gravy in the 18th century was probably made differently from a bechamel, but yes, they are incredibly similar. Today, if I were going to go about making a bechamel sauce, I would melt my butter in my saucepan and then cook the flour into it and then add my milk. If I'm looking at an 18th century English, so not French, and Mary Randolph, whose recipe we're looking at, she is from an English background. She likely would start with with the milk in the pan already, and then have soft butter and flour, mix it together into a paste, and then put that paste into the milk to form the gravy. That is the biggest difference I have noticed between English cooking of the 18th century period and French cooking of the 18th century period. Any other thoughts or questions? You guys are on it today. I love questions.
Are any of these cookbooks available online?
Absolutely, absolutely. Mary Randolph's cookbook is on a project put together by the University of Michigan called Feeding America. If you Google Feeding America, you're going to get the major hits from the organization that whose mission it is to stop hunger across America. But if you type in cookbooks, University of Michigan, you will get this this platform, and it has Mary Randolph's cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, on it. It also has Amelia Simmons' 1796, The American Book of Cookery. I think I have that right. It may be American Cookery. My brain has lost itself there. You can also find a cookbook that I equate to the Julia Child, being the Julia Child of the 18th century, and that is Hannah Glass and her cookbook, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. That one is available on Google Books. If you're interested in looking at manuscript cookbooks, there is, oops, I think my ingredients camera just died. There is an amazing database of 17th and early 18th century cookbook recipe, manuscript cookbooks, so handwritten cookbooks, on the Wellcome Library's website, and that is spelled WELLCOM rather than how we would spell the word welcome. It is a British library, and they have an amazing number of these handwritten cookbooks that they have digitized and put online. There are so many out there. When I started doing this kind of work about 12 years ago, the kinds of resources that we have today were actually, it has been quite a bit more than 12 years ago. I can't math. Anyway, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, the kinds of online cookbook resources that we have today were not out there. If you do a Google or your search platform preference, if you do a search for 18th century cookbooks, you will pop up many, many of which have their full content online. The New York Public Library has scanned many of theirs, and they're on Google Books and other platforms. Archive.org is another amazing platform that has many historic cookbooks digitized. All of the ones I think that I've mentioned so far, American Cookery, the Virginia Housewife, and the Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, I believe those are all on archive.org. The Hockey Trust, HATI, has several as well. So there are a lot of cookbooks out there that are digitized. You do a search and you will have your pick.
And we do have one last question. When will you get smell-o-vision?
I have been participating in online cooking programs since the beginning of the pandemic. And you know what? That is one of the things that I desperately wish we had. Desperately. I would love to be able to share this with you. So I am going to try to give you a look inside the oven. So I've got to rearrange my camera. Give me just a moment. I'm going to turn it off for just a sec, and then we'll take a look inside the oven. Let's see what we can see in there. Oh, it's just starting to rise up on the edges. I don't know if you can see that online. We've got some solid stuff out there on the edges. The center is going to start rising up in just a few more minutes. So I definitely am going to need my full 30 today.
It's getting older.
But as I said, I will get an image of that final one. I'll take a picture as soon as I take it out of the oven, and I can send that around to everyone today. And I will definitely get it on the Zoom as well. So unfortunately, we have hit the end of our time today. I can probably stay on for a couple more minutes, but if you need to pop off, thank you so much for participating in our session of History in the Kitchen today. And we look forward to seeing you again for them this fall. They will be coming back. I don't have dates yet, but look for them sometime in November or December of 2022. So if you'd like to stay around, ask a couple of last questions, we'd love to have you, but otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend.